Most people who joined a cult never saw it coming because the process was never designed to be seen. It began in the most ordinary moment. Research on cult membership populations drawn from exit interviews, survivor testimony, and clinical studies conducted across decades by researchers including Margaret Singer and Michael Langone, has consistently found that people who join high-control religious and ideological groups are not, as a population, mentally ill, unusually naive, or cognitively impaired. They represent a genuine cross-section of the general population in terms of intelligence, education, and psychological functioning. The idea that only a particular type of broken or damaged person joins a cult is not merely inaccurate. It is one of the most psychologically consequential myths that exists around this subject, because it is the myth that most ensures ordinary people do not recognize what is happening to them while it is happening. The person most certain they could never be recruited is, in that certainty, not more protected, only less watchful. The timing of cult recruitment is not random. Clinical observation and research on when people join high control groups has found that the overwhelming majority of initial contact occurs during periods of normal life transition. Graduation, relocation, divorce, bereavement, career change, or the quieter kind of transition that has no name. The period after something has ended and nothing new has yet begun. These are not states of breakdown. They are states of openness. Moments when the identity is genuinely in motion, when the social network has temporarily thinned, when the questions about meaning and direction are louder than usual. Cults do not manufacture vulnerability. They locate it in the completely ordinary form that it takes in a normal human life. If this is staying with you, please like and subscribe. Love bombing, the orchestrated flooding of a new recruit with warmth, attention, validation, and the powerful sense of being genuinely seen and chosen, produces measurable neurological effects. The sudden experience of intense social belonging activates the brain's reward circuits, releasing dopamine and oxytocin in patterns that researchers have compared to the early stages of romantic attachment. The neurological experience is not manufactured in the sense of being fake. It is real warmth, producing real brain chemistry, creating a real and rapidly forming emotional bond. What is manufactured is the context. The warmth is strategically directed, systematically delivered, and will be systematically withdrawn later as a mechanism of control. But the brain, during love bombing, does not know any of that. It only knows it has found something it was looking for. The body responds first, and the body is not skeptical. The commitment mechanics that operate in cult recruitment were mapped long before the study of cults made them relevant. Robert Cialdini's foundational work on influence documented the foot-in-the-door phenomenon. When a person agrees to a small request, the mind updates its self-concept. I am the kind of person who says yes to this, and subsequently finds it internally consistent, even necessary, to agree to larger requests that follow. Cults apply this principle with structural precision. The first yes is always small, reasonable, and entirely plausible as a standalone decision. Come to a free dinner, attend an introductory meeting, read this one chapter. Each agreement is genuinely minor. Each one also moves the internal self-concept one increment closer to the group's definition of who this person is. The first yes is not the trap. It is simply the first step onto a path the mind will later feel it chose. The manufactured sense of being specially chosen, told early in the recruitment process that the group rarely invites people, that the recruiter recognized something in the potential member that others miss, that there is a quality in this particular person that makes them suited to understand what the group knows, exploits a cognitive mechanism that requires no prior psychological damage to activate. Research on self-enhancement and social identity has found that all humans are motivated to view themselves as distinctive, capable, and recognized. Being told that a group of apparently meaningful, purposeful, connected people has specifically identified you as belonging among them speaks directly to a universal need. The recruiter is not creating a vulnerability. They are finding the particular doorway that human psychology reliably provides. There is a door in every mind. The recruiter's job is simply to find the one that is already partly open. Research examining the first contact experiences of former cult members has found that in the vast majority of cases, recruitment was initiated not by a stranger approaching them in public, but by someone they already knew and trusted, a friend, a family member, a classmate, a colleague. This finding matters because it means the initial social proof for the group was not abstract or impersonal, but immediately credible. A person whose judgment the recruit had already incorporated into their model of the world was offering a personal endorsement. The brain's social trust system evaluates information sources before it evaluates information content. A recommendation from a trusted source enters the cognitive system with significantly lower resistance than the same information from a stranger, and it arrives already carrying the weight of an established relationship. The group reaches in through someone you already believed. Social proof, the cognitive shorthand by which the mind infers that something must be good, true, or worth pursuing if enough people are already pursuing it, is systematically manufactured in cult recruitment environments. Introductory events are orchestrated to appear spontaneously full of happy, purposeful, visibly fulfilled people. What looks to the recruit like organic evidence of the group's value is more precisely a performance designed to trigger exactly the social inference the mind draws when it sees a room full of people who seem to have found something. Cialdini's research on social proof established how reliable this cognitive mechanism is across different populations and contexts. The recruit is not fooled because they are credulous. They are responding in the way that human cognition was built to respond to this specific kind of social signal. The crowd feels like evidence. The brain was designed to read it that way. Reciprocity, the deeply wired social obligation the mind experiences after receiving a gift or a favor, is activated early in cult recruitment through precisely calibrated generosity. The free meal, the personal attention, the small but meaningful gift of being listened to, often for the first time in a long while, by someone who appears entirely present. Research by Cialdini and others has established that reciprocity operates at a level below conscious analysis. The sense of obligation it creates does not wait for the recipient to decide whether the gift was appropriate or the attention was genuine. The mind registers having received and then registers being slightly in debt. And that debt creates a subtle internal pressure toward continued engagement with the source. The recruit does not know they are in a transaction. They experience it as a relationship. What felt like kindness was also architecture. The human mind has what researchers studying meaning-making and existential psychology have called a deep need for coherence, for the sense that experience is not random, that events connect to purposes, that the self exists within a story with direction. Terror management theory, developed by Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pishinsky, proposes that much of human social behavior is organized around the management of existential anxiety. The low-level awareness of mortality and meaninglessness that consciousness produces and the mind continually works to buffer. Cults offer a comprehensive and pre-assembled solution to this anxiety, a complete cosmology, a clear moral framework, an account of the self's significance, and a community that shares and reinforces the whole structure. The recruit is not joining something irrational. They are accepting a very complete answer to questions that are genuinely very difficult. The mind in search of meaning does not look for flaws in the first map that offers to show it where it is. Have you ever found yourself in a period of transition more open to ideas and people you would normally approach more carefully? The pattern of activity that cults maintain around new recruits during the recruitment phase serves a cognitive function that is not immediately obvious. Extended meetings, late evening discussions, intense group activities, densely scheduled time. These reduce the periods of solitude in which the critical inner voice, the private internal monologue that evaluates and questions and notices inconsistency, would ordinarily have space to operate. Research on the relationship between solitude and metacognitive awareness has found that the internal examination of one's own beliefs and emotional states requires uninterrupted time alone in ways that are more specific and more cognitively demanding than simply being quiet in a group. The recruit is not yet isolated. They are simply very rarely alone, and the quiet in which doubt might form is quietly filled before it can arrive. Alone time is not just rest, it is when the mind checks its own work. Research on what makes groups socially compelling has found that belonging to a group perceived as exclusive, purposeful, and in possession of special knowledge produces measurable activation in the brain's reward and identity systems. Humans are deeply tribal in their neural architecture. The experience of belonging to an in-group, of being among the people who know what others do not, of sharing a framework that most of the world has missed. These experiences register as deeply satisfying in ways that are entirely independent of whether the knowledge is accurate or the exclusivity is genuine. The cult does not merely offer community. It offers a particular kind of community that speaks to one of the most primary rewards the human social brain recognizes: the sense of being inside, while most of the world remains outside. Belonging to a secret is one of the oldest pleasures the brain knows. The cognitive phenomenon researchers call commitment escalation operates in cult settings through a carefully managed sequence of increasing demands. Each new requirement, attending more frequently, donating more money, spending more time with members and less with outsiders, completing additional study, follows naturally from the prior commitment and carries the accumulated weight of everything already invested. Psychologist Robert Cialdini identified this as consistency pressure. The mind experiences it as deeply uncomfortable to hold a self-concept that has been built through a sequence of public and private commitments, and then to act in a way that contradicts it. Walking away from a group feels like contradicting oneself, and the mind, which dislikes internal contradiction intensely, is motivated to continue rather than to face the dissonance that stopping would require. Every yes makes the next yes feel like the only honest choice. Leon Festinger, who in the 1950s developed cognitive dissonance theory and later embedded himself in a doomsday group to study belief maintenance under DIS, found something that has remained one of the most frequently replicated and cited results in social psychology. When a person has publicly committed to a belief and invested significantly in it, time, money, relationships, identity, the failure of that belief to prove true does not typically produce abandonment. It produces rationalization, reinterpretation, and increased conviction. The investment does not make the belief more accurate. It makes the mind more motivated to protect it. Cults understand this structural feature of human cognition, whether or not they have a name for it. The more a recruit invests, the more their own psychology works to justify the investment as worthwhile. The mind that has given a great deal will work very hard to believe it, gave it for a good reason. Do you remember a time when you stayed somewhere or with something longer than you should have because you had already given so much to it? Front organizations, recruitment arms of high control groups that present themselves as yoga studios, language schools, political movements, personal development seminars, or community service initiatives are effective precisely because the first contact occurs in a context that shares no visible features with the group's true nature. Research on deceptive recruitment has found that this approach is not simply a cynical technique, but a cognitively strategic one. The mind builds its first associations with the group in a context that carries no warning signals, no available cultural scripts for caution, and none of the social vocabulary that would trigger evaluation. By the time the recruit becomes aware of the group's actual nature, if they become aware at all, they have already formed attachments, made investments, and developed an internal sense of commitment that was built in a context where suspicion had no place to stand. The first chapter was written before the recruit knew they were reading. The inner critical voice. The internal narrator that evaluates, questions, notices inconsistency, and generates the experience of doubt, begins to be shaped during even the earliest stages of cult contact, before most recruits would describe themselves as members of anything. Research on social influence and the suppression of self-generated counter-arguments has found that environments which provide continuous external answers to questions reduce the rate at which the mind generates questions internally. When every uncertainty is immediately met with a confident, communal, authoritative response, the mind gradually stops investing cognitive resources in generating uncertainties of its own. The habit of questioning is not removed. It is simply rehearsed less often in an environment that has made its rehearsal feel unnecessary, and habits that stop being rehearsed stop feeling natural. The questioning voice does not fall silent. It simply stops being practiced and then stops being heard. Some of the most significant research on thought reform has come not from the study of cults specifically, but from the study of all high-pressure belief change environments, prisoner of war camps, political re-education programs, intensive initiation processes. Robert Lifton's landmark 1961 work Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, which remains foundational in this field, drew on interviews with survivors of Chinese thought reform and identified a set of psychological mechanisms that operate across very different ideological contexts. The implication of his findings, confirmed and extended by decades of subsequent research, is that the capacity for thought reform is not a feature of cult membership specifically. It is a feature of the human mind when placed inside certain kinds of total social environments. The environment does not require consent. It requires only sufficient control of the conditions of daily life. No one needs to be broken to be reshaped. They only need to stay long enough inside the right conditions. The research on who joins cults and who does not has gradually shifted from a focus on individual vulnerability to a focus on circumstance and social architecture. Studies by Stephen Hassan, who developed the BITE model to describe the behavioral, informational, thought, and emotional control systems used by high control groups and by scholars at the International Cultic Studies Association, have consistently found that the question is not which people are susceptible, but which environments are sufficiently total. Under conditions of sufficient milieu control, social isolation, information management, and behavioral regulation, the vast majority of ordinarily functioning adults show measurable changes in belief, identity, and autonomous decision-making. The line between the person who joined and the person who did not is very often not a line inside the person. It is a line between the social environment they encountered and the one that came just slightly too close. The difference between joining and not joining is, in most cases, an accident of proximity. The process does not accelerate. That is one of the things that makes it so difficult to see from the inside. It continues at exactly the pace that feels, at each individual step, like simply more of what was already normal. Milieu control, the first of the 8 criteria Robert Lifton identified in Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, refers to the systematic regulation of the environment in which a person spends their time. It does not require walls or locked doors. It requires only that the hours of the day be full enough, the social world narrow enough, and the group's presence consistent enough that the environmental conditions shaping thought and feeling are primarily those the group provides rather than those the recruit brought with them. Lifton found this in Chinese thought reform programs, but researchers since have documented its functional equivalent in groups that operate openly, in buildings with unlocked exits, in countries with full legal freedoms. The control is not of the person's movement, it is of the informational and social climate inside which their mind operates every day. The cage, if that is the right word for it, is made of schedule and company rather than of walls. Information control follows naturally from milieu control and deepens its effect. High control groups systematically regulate what members read, watch, discuss, and research, not always through explicit prohibition, but through the creation of a framework in which seeking information from outside sources is coded as spiritually dangerous, psychologically weak, or a sign of insufficient commitment. Research on information environments and belief maintenance has found that the mind's capacity to evaluate a belief critically depends significantly on exposure to genuine alternatives, not simply the group's characterization of those alternatives, but actual engagement with different frameworks and different sources. When the information environment is sufficiently curated, the mind does not experience itself as restricted, it experiences itself as protected. The difference between those two things is invisible from inside the environment that maintains it. What the mind does not know it is missing, it cannot grieve. Thought-terminating cliches, a term Robert Lifton coined in the 1960s to describe phrases that compress complex problems into brief, definitive-sounding statements that end rather than engage inquiry, function as a kind of cognitive interrupt. When doubt arises about doctrine, when an experience produces internal friction with the group's teaching, when the critical voice begins to form a question that would be genuinely difficult to answer, the thought-terminating cliché arrives to close the gap before it can open fully. Lifton described these as the language of non-thought, phrases that feel like answers but function as stops. Research in cognitive psychology on motivated reasoning has confirmed the mechanism. A statement that sounds like resolution produces the neurological experience of resolution, whether or not the underlying question has actually been addressed. The mind, feeling the discomfort of an open question, accepts the substitute and moves on. The question did not get answered. It got interrupted at the point where the discomfort was highest. Language loading, the development and intensive use of a specialized vocabulary that carries meanings available only to group members, restructures thought by restructuring the material thought is conducted in. Lifton observed that when everyday concepts are replaced by in-group terms, and when those terms carry emotional and doctrinal weight that outsiders cannot access, the mind begins to think in the group's language and consequently to find the group's conclusions emerging from its own thinking as if naturally. Research on linguistic relativity, the documented relationship between the language available to a mind and the range of thoughts it generates spontaneously, suggests this is not merely a social effect. The vocabulary a mind uses shapes the cognitive options it perceives. When the vocabulary has been replaced, the available thoughts quietly change with it. The new language does not feel like a replacement. It feels like finally having the right words. Have you ever noticed how a group you belong to had phrases that only made sense inside it? And how those phrases made certain questions feel already answered? The demand for purity, Lifton's fourth criterion of thought reform, operates by creating a moral standard that is genuinely impossible to meet, and then connecting the person's spiritual worth, their standing within the group, and their very eligibility for whatever salvation or transformation the group promises, to how closely they approach that standard. The impossibility is structurally important. A standard that could be reached would provide the mind with a stable resting point. An unreachable standard keeps the mind in perpetual striving, perpetual monitoring of its own compliance, and perpetual vulnerability to shame, which the group can then relieve through renewed commitment and deeper engagement. Research on shame and social control has found that shame, unlike guilt, does not motivate repair of a specific action. It motivates the suppression of the self that produced the action. Under a demand for purity, the self is always the problem, and the group is always the solution. The standard moves just ahead of wherever you are. It is designed to confession, the practice, required in many high control groups, of regularly disclosing personal failures, doubts, and transgressions to group leaders or the collective, serves multiple psychological functions that research has documented in both religious and secular contexts. Clinically, voluntary disclosure of private experience can reduce anxiety and increase a sense of interpersonal closeness. Within a high control group, however, the disclosed information does not remain private. It enters a database of vulnerabilities that leadership can draw on to maintain compliance. The member who confessed something they deeply fear being known about is now bound by the risk that non-compliance might make that information relevant. Research on social surveillance and behavior modification has found that the awareness of being potentially monitored, even without certainty that monitoring is occurring, produces consistent behavioral conformity. The confession did not only provide relief, it also provided collateral. What was shared in trust was also structurally stored. After approximately 24 hours without sleep, brainwave patterns show measurable disruption. Alpha waves associated with relaxed, wakeful awareness become irregular, and theta waves, typically present during light sleep and early stages of dreaming, begin intruding into waking consciousness. EEG studies have documented that this intrusion is accompanied by reduced prefrontal activity, compromised reality testing, and a measurable increase in suggestibility, the mind's tendency to accept external frameworks in place of internally generated evaluation. Many high control groups incorporate sleep restriction as a structural feature of intensive retreat programs, extended meeting schedules, or communal living arrangements where late-night activities and early morning obligations are normalized. The cognitive effect is not incidental. A mind operating in a state of theta wave intrusion is significantly less capable of maintaining the critical distance that would allow it to evaluate what it is being told. The state the brain enters under sleep deprivation is the same state it enters at the border of dreams. The group's teachings arrive while that border is open. Sustained sleep restriction across multiple days produces cumulative effects that are qualitatively different from a single night's loss. Research at major sleep laboratories has documented that chronic partial sleep deprivation, being consistently limited to 4 or 5 hours rather than being fully deprived, impairs hippocampal function in ways that affect memory formation, reduces activity in the prefrontal regions responsible for logical reasoning and the evaluation of evidence, and disrupts the default mode network in ways that compromise self-reflection and identity maintenance. Former members of groups that maintain demanding communal schedules across weeks and months have consistently described, in retrospect, a period in which the boundary between their prior self and the group's version of who they were seemed to dissolve without a clear moment at which it happened. The neuroscience of chronic sleep restriction provides part of the explanation for why that boundary feels thin precisely when it matters most. The self that would evaluate the situation needs sleep to maintain its architecture. The group's schedule ensures that sleep is never quite enough. Restricted nutrition through fasting practices, highly specific dietary rules, or communal eating schedules that reduce caloric intake produces cognitive states that parallel, in measurable ways, some of the effects of sleep restriction. Research on the cognitive effects of caloric restriction and hypoglycemia has found that low blood glucose reduces prefrontal cortex activity, impairs working memory, increases emotional reactivity, and heightens the mind's responsiveness to external direction when its capacity for internal direction has been diminished. Many high-control groups incorporate fasting or dietary restriction within spiritual frameworks that assign positive meaning to the experience, framing the cognitive vulnerability it produces as spiritual opening, heightened receptivity, or evidence of progress. The mind in a state of mild nutritional restriction is not being manipulated in the gross sense. It is simply less capable, in a documented and specific way, of maintaining the autonomous evaluative functions that independent judgment requires. The experience is coded as transcendence. The mechanism is metabolic, repetitive chanting, call and response recitation, and rhythmic prayer practiced in many high-control groups for extended daily periods produce measurable changes in brain activity. Research published in the journal Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience and in Neurophysiological Studies on Religious Chanting has found that sustained rhythmic repetition shifts brainwave activity toward alpha and theta states. Reduced beta activity associated with analytical, critical cognition, and increased slower wave activity associated with relaxed, receptive, and non-evaluative awareness. EEG studies specifically measuring religious chanting have documented reduced self-oriented thought and decreased mind-wandering during the practice. These are, in certain contexts, genuinely valuable cognitive states. Within a high-control environment, however, They are states in which the mind is significantly less likely to generate the spontaneous self-referential questioning that might otherwise notice what the environment is doing. The relaxation is real. What it relaxes includes the faculty that might otherwise ask questions. The amygdala, the brain's primary threat detection and fear processing structure, responds to low-grade social threat as reliably as it responds to physical danger. Research has found that environments characterized by subtle but persistent uncertainty about one's standing, safety, and belonging, such as groups in which approval is contingent and can be withdrawn without warning, in which the rules shift quietly over time, or in which the consequences of non-compliance are implied rather than specified, maintain the amygdala in a state of low-level activation that is cognitively expensive. Sustained amygdala activation narrows attentional focus, reduces the range of perspectives the mind considers, impairs the retrieval of information from long-term memory, and compromises the prefrontal functions involved in complex moral reasoning. The member does not feel terrified. They feel alert, vigilant, slightly anxious, without a clear object for the anxiety, a state that keeps them oriented toward the group for reassurance rather than away from it in critical analysis. The anxiety does not feel like fear. It feels like caring very much about getting things right. The incremental isolation from outside relationships, family members, old friends, former colleagues, anyone whose attachment to the pre-cult self might provide an alternative social mirror, does not typically arrive as an explicit demand. Research on isolation mechanics in high control groups has found that outside relationships are more commonly undermined through a process of graduated devaluation. Former friends are described as spiritually limited, family members as unable to understand what the member has found, outside social connections as distractions from the real work the group is offering. The member arrives at reduced outside contact through a sequence of individually reasonable-seeming steps, each of which makes sense within the group's framework, and each of which makes the next step more likely by reducing the number of people in the member's life who would offer a different framework. The outside world does not disappear. It is simply reclassified until it feels irrelevant. The binary cognitive structure that high control groups install, in which the world is divided exhaustively into the enlightened and the unenlightened, the saved and the unsaved, the awake and the asleep, does more than create social division. Research in cognitive psychology on black and white thinking has found that when a person's working cognitive framework divides all information into two exclusive categories, the processing of genuinely ambiguous information, information that would normally produce the productive uncertainty of further inquiry, is significantly impaired. Ambiguous evidence is automatically routed into whichever category the framework provides, without the pause that ambiguity would ordinarily require. Critical thinking depends on holding uncertainty open long enough to examine it. A framework that provides a category for everything preempts exactly that pause. When every question already has an address, the mind stops walking the street looking for one. Have you ever noticed how, inside a group you were very committed to, doubt started to feel less like thinking and more like disloyalty. When a person has made significant public commitment to a belief, telling others, acting on it, organizing their social life around it, and then encounters evidence that challenges the belief, the research on cognitive dissonance initiated by Leon Festinger predicts a predictable internal response, not reconsideration, but motivated reinterpretation. Within a high control group, this process is reinforced structurally. The member who begins to experience doubt is not encouraged to investigate it. They are encouraged to share it in a confessional context where it will be redirected to increase their engagement as the prescribed response to doubt and to understand the doubt itself as a test or a symptom of the very problem the group exists to address. The dissonance is not resolved by moving the belief toward the evidence. It is resolved by moving the interpretation of the evidence toward the belief. The doubt becomes proof of the need for more commitment. The architecture of the trap closes around the key that might have opened it. Many high control groups engineer peak experiences, moments of apparent transcendence, emotional intensity, or felt certainty that arrive during group rituals and are subsequently interpreted as confirmation of the group's doctrine. Research on peak states and belief consolidation has found that experiences of profound emotional intensity, awe, or felt unity, regardless of their trigger, are encoded in memory with greater vividness and emotional weight than ordinary experiences, and that the cognitive framework available at the moment of encoding shapes how the experience is interpreted and stored. When the only framework available is the group's, when the language of the experience, the social context of its occurrence, and the explanation offered for what happened are all controlled by the group, the peak state becomes, in memory, evidence, not evidence that was evaluated, evidence that was felt, which is considerably more resistant to subsequent revision. The experience was genuine. The interpretation of it was not spontaneous. Inside communal living and intensive group schedules, the dreaming mind is among the most uncontrolled cognitive spaces the member still possesses. Research on REM sleep and emotional memory processing has found that the sleeping brain continues to process unresolved emotional material, conflicts, inconsistencies, suppressed doubts, in ways that bypass the waking suppression systems the group's techniques have been building. Former cult members have described, in clinical interviews, periods during which their dreams became the only location in which their previous identity appeared clearly. The voice of a parent, an image from life before, an emotional quality that felt like themselves from before the group had a name for who they were. Sleep research suggests this is not coincidence. The dreaming brain processes what the waking brain has been trained to redirect. It does not respect the thought-terminating cliché. It does not know the group's vocabulary for why some things cannot be thought. In the dream, the door is still open that the day has learned to keep closed. The practice of regular public testimony, standing before the group to describe personal transformation, renewed commitment, or gratitude for the group's teachings, functions as a mechanism of identity consolidation that research in social psychology traces back to self-perception theory. The mind watches itself perform a belief and, in part, comes to believe it more fully as a result of the performance. Each time a member testifies to what the group has given them, they are not simply reporting an inner state. They are producing one or reinforcing one that was already present. Research on the relationship between verbal self-expression and belief strength has found that articulating a belief publicly, particularly in an emotionally engaged and socially rewarding context, measurably increases the holder's subjective certainty about it. The testimony is not a symptom of belief. It is also one of its causes. The performance of conviction is, in a documented neurological sense, one of the ways conviction is made. High control groups manage the emotional states of their members through a pattern that researchers have compared in its functional structure to operant conditioning. The alternation of experiences of warmth, belonging, and elevation with experiences of shame, doubt, or withdrawal of approval creates an emotional schedule in which positive states become reliably associated with compliance and negative states with insufficient commitment. Research on intermittent reinforcement, the finding that rewards delivered on an unpredictable rather than consistent schedule produce significantly stronger behavioral conditioning than those delivered reliably, suggests that the irregular delivery of emotional approval is not simply cruel, but, from a conditioning standpoint, the most effective possible schedule. The member does not experience this as manipulation. They experience the highs as earned and the lows as instructive, and pursue the former with the energy of someone who has learned that the path to relief leads through the group. The mind learns the shape of the maze it is in and calls the learning progress. After months of milieu control, information restriction, sleep reduction, language replacement, and the systematic conditioning of emotional states, the interior landscape of the member looks genuinely different from what it was at the point of first contact. Research on belief systems and extended group immersion has found that the internal critic, the evaluative voice that generates questions and notices inconsistency, is not simply suppressed but has been, in a functional sense, replaced. Where it once arose spontaneously to examine a claim or an instruction, it now arrives already speaking the group's vocabulary, already routing doubt toward the group's prescribed response, already carrying the emotional weight of the shame that non-compliance has been made to feel like. The member has not had a procedure performed on them. They have been given an environment, and the environment has done what environments do, shaped the mind that lived inside it for long enough to be shaped. The voice that was theirs and the voice the group gave them have become, from the inside, the same voice. The difference is no longer audible to the person it happened to. There is a point inside the process where the question of whether to leave stops being a practical one and becomes something considerably harder to name. The external controls have been reinforced long enough that they have found their way inside. What began as environment has become, quietly, interior architecture. Robert Lifton's criterion he called doctrine over person, describes a mechanism that functions as the final seal on the critical voice. When a member's direct personal experience, a contradiction they observed, a feeling that arose despite being forbidden, a memory of who they were before, conflicts with the group's official account of reality, it is the experience, not the doctrine, that is invalidated. Lifton found this operating consistently across different ideological and religious totalizing groups. The individual's lived perception is treated as evidence, not of a problem with the doctrine, but of a problem with the individual. Their insufficient faith, their unresolved ego, their continued attachment to the old false self. The result is a mind that has been trained to distrust its own experience as the primary data source about the world, and to treat the group's framework as more reliable than anything the senses, the memory, or the emotions directly report. The person stops trusting what they notice. They begin, instead, to trust what they have been told they should notice. The related principle Lifton called sacred science refers to the elevation of the group's core doctrine to a status that places it entirely beyond the reach of examination, questioning, or empirical evaluation. Any framework that functions as a complete and final explanation of reality, in which all evidence confirms the doctrine, in which challenge is treated as proof of the challenger's moral or intellectual deficiency, and in which the very act of questioning the framework is evidence of the questioner's corruption, has effectively removed itself from the category of ideas that can be tested. Research on epistemic closure and motivated reasoning has found that belief systems structured this way are not only more resistant to revision than ordinary beliefs, but are psychologically more satisfying in specific ways. They reduce the cognitive burden of uncertainty, provide a stable identity anchor, and create the experience of living in full possession of the truth. They are satisfying precisely because they are closed. A framework that explains everything, including why it should not be questioned, is the most complete cognitive trap that exists. The charismatic leader who stands at the center of most high control groups is not simply a personality type that the group happens to attract. Research on charismatic authority and group dynamics has found that charismatic leadership produces a specific psychological effect in followers that is distinct from the influence of competent, trustworthy, or even beloved leaders who do not operate within a charismatic framework. The charismatic leader is experienced not merely as someone whose judgment is good, but as someone whose authority is not subject to the normal evaluative criteria that apply to other people's claims. This is not a cognitive failure in the follower. It is a documented social psychological process in which the attributed exceptional quality of the leader explicitly and structurally suspends the mental mechanism that would otherwise require their claims to earn their credibility through normal means. Once that suspension is in place, the leader's statements enter the mind on a different channel than ordinary claims, one that does not route through evaluation. The authority is not earned through evidence. It is established through a kind that of attribution that makes evidence irrelevant. The concept sociologist Janja Lalich developed across her comparative studies of Heaven's Gate and the Democratic Workers' Party, bounded choice addresses what happens to autonomous decision-making inside a total environment. From outside a high-control group, the members' continued compliance often appears as a choice freely made because the choices occur in the absence of explicit physical coercion. Lalique's framework demonstrates that this reading misunderstands what freedom requires. Genuine choice requires access to alternatives, accurate information about consequences, and an identity sufficiently independent of the choosing environment to be capable of choosing against it. Inside a closed system, all three conditions have been systematically removed. The choices the member makes are real choices, but the range of options available, the information shaping them, and the self doing the choosing have all been constructed by the same system that will benefit from whatever they choose. The architecture of the trap does not need locked doors. It needs only to have built the walls inside. Every decision made inside a total environment is made by a self that the environment has had a hand in building. Sunk cost psychology, the well-documented cognitive tendency to continue investing in something because of what has already been invested, even when present evidence suggests the investment is no longer serving its original purpose, operates in cult membership with compounding force because what has been invested is not merely money or time, but identity, relationships, and the entire scaffolding of meaning through which the member currently understands the world. Research on commitment escalation and sunk cost bias has found that the magnitude of the effect scales directly with the comprehensiveness of the investment, and nothing is more comprehensive than having organized one's entire life, self-concept, and social world around a single structure. The member who considers leaving is not calculating a financial loss. They are facing the cognitive equivalent of dismantling the building they are currently living inside, without knowing what they will find on the other side of the demolition. The more completely a person has built their life around something, the more completely leaving it feels like ending that life. The social pain of ostracism, the threatened or actual exclusion from the group, activates neural circuitry that neuroimaging research has established shares significant overlap with the circuitry involved in physical pain. Naomi Eisenberger and colleagues at UCLA, in an fMRI study published in Science, found that social exclusion in a virtual ball-tossing game activated the anterior cingulate cortex and related regions associated with the distress component of physical pain experience. Within a high control group, the threat of shunning is not experienced by the mind as a social disappointment. It is experienced as something that activates genuine pain pathways, producing a visceral response that is difficult to distinguish from the inside from physical threat. The group does not need to specify the consequences of leaving with any legal precision. The brain has already registered what is at stake in the currency of a system far older and more immediate than conscious reasoning. The threat of exclusion does not need to be spoken aloud. The body has already heard it. Trauma bonding, the strong emotional attachment that forms under conditions of intermittent reinforcement, combining periods of warmth and periods of withdrawal, shame, or fear, produces neurobiological changes that research has found to involve the dopamine and oxytocin systems in ways that parallel the attachment dynamics of early caregiving relationships. The unpredictability of the reward, the fact that warmth arrives inconsistently, without a reliable pattern the mind can learn to anticipate, is not a flaw in the conditioning, but its most effective feature. Research on intermittent reinforcement schedules has established that unpredictable rewards produce stronger behavioral conditioning and more persistent attachment than reliable ones. The member does not stay because they are unaware of the inconsistency. They stay in part because the inconsistency itself, the hope for the next moment of warmth, has been made neurologically compelling in ways that conscious reasoning reaches only with difficulty. The pull is not toward the person who hurts them. It is toward the version of the group that was warm, and that version has not entirely disappeared. Inside the thought reform environment, the inner voice undergoes a transformation that goes beyond suppression. Research on internalized surveillance and self-monitoring in high control groups has found that members develop what clinical observers have described as an internal watcher, a version of the group's standards that has been fully incorporated into the self and now monitors thought, not just behavior, in real time. The mind that once generated doubt now generates a response to doubt before the doubt can fully form. A flash of shame, a thought-terminating phrase, an internal redirection toward the prescribed response. This is not simply obedience. It is the internalization of a system of control so complete that the member has become, without any external enforcement, their own most vigilant monitor. The group no longer needs to watch. The member watches for them. At this stage, the surveillance is not something done to the person. It is something the person does to themselves, in a voice that sounds entirely like their own. Lifton's 8th criterion, what he called the dispensing of existence, captures the most structurally extreme of the thought reform mechanisms, the implicit or explicit conviction, installed through the group's doctrine and social culture, that life outside the group is not simply less good, but in some fundamental sense, not valid, not real, not viable. This may be expressed through apocalyptic theology, through a belief that those outside the group are spiritually dead or existentially asleep, or simply through the consistent cultural message that meaningful life is only possible within the group's framework. When this is fully installed, leaving does not feel like a choice to relocate to a different and equally valid life. It feels like stepping off the edge of the known world into a space the mind has no structure for inhabiting. The exit is not blocked. It is simply that the mind has been given a compelling and thoroughly reinforced reason to believe that what is on the other side of it is not life. Leaving is no longer a departure. It has been made to feel like an ending. Research on exit barriers in high control groups has found a consistent and specific cognitive profile in members who consider leaving but do not follow through. They are not, as a rule, unaware that something is wrong. They frequently have a clear private awareness of the contradiction between their experience and the group's official account of it. What they lack is not the perception of the problem, but a psychologically viable path between perceiving it and acting on it, a path that would require simultaneously navigating the loss of every relationship built inside the group, the dismantling of the worldview that currently organizes all meaning, the confrontation of the years already invested, and the prospect of re-entering an outside world that the group has spent months or years characterizing as hostile, corrupt, or spiritually barren. The mind assesses the route and finds it impassable, not because leaving is genuinely impossible, but because the cost calculation has been constructed to always render it that way. The door is unlocked. The architecture around it makes it feel like a wall. Gaslighting, the systematic invalidation of a person's perception of reality by an authority figure who insists that what the person experienced did not occur, was misunderstood, or reflects their own spiritual or psychological deficit, impairs the functioning of what cognitive researchers call reality monitoring, the mind's capacity to distinguish between what it actually perceived and what was suggested or imagined. Research on memory malleability and external suggestion has found that repeated, confident assertion from an authority figure about what happened or did not happen can alter the subjective confidence a person has in their own memory of an event, even when that memory was initially strong and detailed. Inside a high control group, where the authority figure's account of reality is structurally elevated above the member's own perceptual report, the gaslighting effect does not arrive as an isolated incident. It is the steady, continuous operating environment of the member's daily cognitive life. After long enough, the member stops arguing with the account they are given. They begin, instead, to wonder why their own memory keeps being wrong. The member's internal model of the outside world has, by this stage, been systematically distorted in ways that independently reinforce the barriers to exit. Research on in-group and out-group cognition has found that sustained immersion in a totalistic environment produces genuine changes in how the mind encodes and recalls information about people and institutions outside the group. Not simply negative evaluation, but structural alterations in how the outside world is represented, how complex its problems are imagined to be, and how capable the member imagines themselves of navigating it without the group's support. The outside world that a member leaving would be returning to is not the outside world that actually exists. It is a cognitive model constructed inside the very environment that needed the outside world to seem inhospitable. The member is not making a decision based on false beliefs they consciously hold. They are navigating using a map that was drawn by the institution they would need to leave in order to discover it is wrong. You cannot see the inaccuracy of the map while you are still inside the territory it describes. The prescribed response to doubt within most high control groups is not reflection but intensified action. More study, more service, more attendance, more confession, more financial contribution. Research on behavioral commitment and belief reinforcement has found that this instruction is not as counterintuitive as it appears. Acting on a belief, particularly publicly, effortfully, and at personal cost, is one of the most reliable ways to increase subjective certainty in that belief. Prescribing behavior as the remedy for doubt, therefore, functions as a device that uses doubt as raw material to generate its own resolution, converting the potential energy of questioning into the kinetic energy of deeper commitment. The member who doubts and then serves more deeply does not emerge with the doubt answered. They emerge with the doubt buried under the weight of their own subsequent investment, which the mind reads as evidence that the doubt was unwarranted. The doubt was used as fuel. It powered the very engine it might have otherwise stopped. Many high control groups maintain a persistent sense of urgency through apocalyptic, end times, or mission-critical frameworks. The world is about to end. The window for spiritual transformation is closing. The enemies of the group are advancing. The work has never been more urgent than it is right now. Research on temporal urgency and decision-making has found that a persistent sense that time is critically limited impairs the kind of slow, reflective deliberation that major life decisions require. Urgency narrows the temporal horizon of the mind's evaluation. It compresses consideration toward the immediate and the action-oriented, and away from the long-view reflection in which the member's prior life, values, and the full trajectory of what they have given and what it has produced might be honestly weighed. There is never, within this framework, a good moment to step back. The moment to step back always costs something the group has made to feel irreplaceable. The permanent emergency is not incidental to the control. It is one of its primary instruments. The dreams of members in deep immersion, as reported in clinical post-cult interviews and survivor accounts and examined in relation to dream research, often carry the residue of the suppressed self in ways that the waking mind cannot. Research on REM dreaming and emotional processing confirms that the sleeping brain revisits unresolved emotional conflicts and represents material that waking suppression has not fully extinguished. The dreaming mind does not have access to the group's vocabulary for why certain thoughts are forbidden, and it does not experience shame as a thought terminator in the way the waking mind has been trained to. Several researchers studying cult recovery have noted that for some members, the first signal of genuine doubt was not a waking intellectual moment, but a repeated dream in which an earlier version of themselves appeared and felt more real than the version that woke up the following morning. Something in the sleeping mind remembers a self that the waking mind has been taught to call incomplete. The point at which the internal watcher becomes automatic, when the surveillance of one's own thoughts for doctrinal impurity no longer requires effort but happens reflexively, below the level of deliberate attention, represents a qualitative shift in what the thought reform process has accomplished. Research on habit formation and automatic behavior has found that behaviors and thought patterns practiced with sufficient regularity across sufficient time move from effortful, attention-demanding executive processes to automatic implicit ones that operate without conscious direction. Once self-monitoring has become automatic, The member is no longer choosing to comply. They are complying in the way that any sufficiently rehearsed habit operates, without intention, without the felt sense of choosing, without the internal experience of restraint that might otherwise signal the presence of external control. The control has completed its migration from outside the self to inside it. There is no longer any felt pressure from outside. The pressure now lives where freedom used to. Total certainty, the complete resolution of ambiguity that a sufficiently closed belief system provides, is not merely a compensation for freedom lost. Research on intolerance of uncertainty and anxiety has found that genuine cognitive uncertainty produces measurable psychological distress, and that relief from it is experienced as rewarding in the brain's valuation systems. Living inside a total system that answers all questions, assigns all meaning, explains all experience, and provides a complete identity is, for a mind that had been navigating the ambiguity of ordinary life, genuinely and neurologically relieving. This is one of the most important and least discussed findings in cult research, that many members are not held there primarily by fear. Though fear is also present, they are held there partly by the genuine psychological comfort of having every question answered, by the felt sense that the restless, uncertain, question-carrying self they used to be has finally been given somewhere solid to stand. The trap is comfortable. That is the most important thing it is. Discomfort would make it easier to leave. The peculiar quality of life at deep immersion, when the initial excitement has long passed, when the love-bombing warmth is a distant memory, when the compliance is automatic and the internal landscape has been flattened into the group's contours, is not one of obvious suffering. Research on hedonic adaptation and controlled environments has found that the mind adjusts its baseline of normal to whatever conditions it reliably inhabits. The member in deep immersion has adapted. They feel a muted version of the emotional range that was once available to them, a reduced access to the particular quality of selfhood that had been built before the group arrived to improve it, a quieter inner life in a space that was once considerably louder. But they do not experience this as loss, because the self that would register the loss as loss, the one that remembers how much louder it used to be, is the self the group has spent all this time replacing. The absence of the self is not visible to the self that has been built in its place. The cost of membership is not billed at the beginning. It arrives gradually, in installments small enough that each one feels acceptable, until the total sum of what has been given, what has been altered, and what has been quietly taken is very large indeed. Stephen Hassan, a former member of the Unification Church, who subsequently earned a doctorate studying cult influence and developed the BITE model as a clinical and analytical framework, identified 4 distinct but interlocking domains through which high control groups maintain authority over members: behavior, information, thought, and emotion. The significance of the model lies not in any individual component, but in their systemic interaction. Research on the BITE model's application has confirmed that when any one domain is sufficiently controlled, the others tend to follow without requiring additional enforcement. Control behavior comprehensively enough, and thought patterns will begin to align with the behaviors. Control information completely enough, and emotional responses will be shaped by what the curated information allows. The four systems do not operate separately on the member's psychology. They operate as a single, mutually reinforcing architecture that leaves progressively fewer spaces in the member's inner life that the group has not reached. What any one component does not cover, another does. The gaps close each other. The installation of exit phobia, a specific, persistent fear of what will happen to the member if they leave, is one of the most deliberately engineered aspects of high-control group membership. Research on phobia induction through social and doctrinal means has found that the mind does not require a traumatic single event to develop a phobic response to a category of action. Repeated, authoritative, and emotionally loaded warnings about the catastrophic consequences of leaving, spiritual damnation, psychological collapse, physical danger, or the certainty of a meaningless and failed life outside, can produce a conditioned fear response to the very thought of departure that operates with the same involuntary quality as clinically induced phobia. The member who considers leaving does not simply calculate risks. They experience a visceral, automatic, internally sourced fear, a fear the group placed there, but which now registers as genuinely their own, arising from inside and therefore difficult to identify as something that was ever externally installed. The fear of leaving was taught, but it was taught so early and so thoroughly that it no longer feels learned. It feels like knowing. Cults reshape the autobiographical memory of their members in ways that clinical researchers studying post-cult recovery have documented consistently. The narrative a member constructs about their pre-cult life, who they were, what they had, what they were moving toward, is gradually revised through the group's interpretation of that history. The pre-cult self is characterized as lost, damaged, searching, or spiritually blind, while the post-recruitment self is characterized as transformed, found, or chosen. When this revision is sufficiently complete, the member does not simply prefer their current life over their previous one. They have genuinely lost meaningful access to an honest account of who they were before, because every retrieval of that memory passes through a framework that has already decided what it means. Memory, as research on reconstructive recall has confirmed, is not a recording. It is built fresh each time it is accessed, shaped by the framework the current self provides. Inside the group, the framework always tells the same story. The pre-cult self has not been destroyed. It has been translated into a language that makes it unrecognizable. The psychological profile of the charismatic leader at the center of most high control groups has been studied by researchers including Robert Hare, whose work on psychopathic personality features, and by cult scholars including Jean-Jacques Lalich and Michael Langone, whose comparative analyses of cult leaders have identified a recognizable cluster of characteristics: a grandiose self-concept, a pattern of exploiting followers' trust and resources, a profound imperviousness to the normal social feedback that would otherwise moderate behavior, an inability to experience genuine empathy for members' suffering, except where that empathy serves a strategic purpose, and a drive for total control that is both consistent across different groups and consistent across different cultural and ideological contexts. These features are not incidental to why the group functions as it does. They are causally central to it. A mind that is structurally incapable of registering the harm it causes, and structurally driven toward the kind of total authority that allows it to demand anything, is precisely the kind of mind that builds a total environment. The harm is not a side effect of the leader's psychology. It is the environment that the leader's psychology naturally produces. Narcissistic authority structures sustain group cohesion through a mechanism that researchers studying authoritarian group dynamics have called the mirroring function of followers. The group exists at a deep structural level as an extension of the leader's self-concept, providing the constant reflection of specialness, uniqueness, and grandiosity that the leader's psychological architecture requires. Members who provide this reflection are valued. Members who fail to provide it, who express doubt, who question, who show insufficient devotion, are experienced by the leader not as people exercising normal human judgment, but as sources of narcissistic injury, and they are responded to accordingly with a force that is disproportionate to the apparent offense. This disproportionality, the sudden, dramatic punishment of what appeared to be minor non-compliance, is one of the most consistent features of high-control group dynamics reported by survivors, and research on narcissistic injury responses provides its structural explanation. The leader is not responding to the member's behavior. They are responding to what the behavior does to the internal mirror. The devotion is not enough. It is only ever enough until the moment it is not. The evolutionary dimensions of why tribal belonging is so difficult to leave, even when the tribe has become harmful, trace back to the neural architecture of social species and the conditions under which it was shaped. Research on human social evolution and the costs of group exclusion has found that for most of human evolutionary history, being cast out of the group was not a social inconvenience but a survival threat. Access to food, protection, mates, and the resources necessary for survival were bound up with group membership in ways that made exclusion genuinely lethal with high frequency. The brain that modern humans carry into cult dynamics is the brain that was calibrated under those conditions. The systems that process belonging and exclusion are ancient, powerful, and poorly calibrated for an environment in which leaving is logistically possible, but neurologically registered as existential threat. The cult did not create this vulnerability. It inherited it and learned precisely how to speak to it. The ancient brain does not know the difference between leaving a cult and leaving the only group that can keep you alive. It treats them the same way. What happens to the mind after it leaves a high control group is as documented and as specific as what happened to it while it was inside. Research on post-cult cognitive aftereffects, synthesized by Margaret Singer and others in clinical work with former members, has identified a recognizable set of ongoing cognitive and emotional disturbances, simplistic, black and white thinking patterns that persist well beyond exit, automatic obedience responses to trigger words from the group's loaded vocabulary, flashbacks and intrusive thoughts connected to cult experiences, difficulty making decisions independently, particularly when the decisions carry moral weight, a pervasive sense of unreality when navigating a world that no longer provides the total structure the cult supplied. These are not the signs of a mind that was always fragile. They are the signs of a mind that was thoroughly and specifically reshaped, and that is now trying to operate in conditions for which its current architecture was not built. The cult recedes. What it built inside continues to run. Among the most persistent post-cult cognitive residues is what researchers and clinicians have called the floating phenomenon, a dissociative state in which former members, long after physical exit, find themselves involuntarily pulled back into the group's cognitive framework when exposed to specific triggers. A piece of music that was used in rituals, a phrase from the group's vocabulary, a smell or visual stimulus associated with the environment. Research on context-dependent memory and conditioned emotional responses has found that memories encoded within a total environment, a setting with distinctive sensory, emotional, and cognitive features, are stored with those environmental cues as part of the retrieval structure and can be involuntarily accessed when those cues reappear even years later in an entirely different context. The former member is not choosing to return to the group's framework in these moments. The framework returns to them through the same mechanisms of conditioned response that were built around them when they were inside. The mind that left is visited, sometimes by the environment that built it. The thought-terminating cliches that were installed during membership do not depart with the member when they leave. Research on overlearned verbal habits and the persistence of automatic cognitive patterns has found that responses practiced with sufficient frequency, particularly in emotionally charged, high arousal contexts, become what cognitive psychologists call overlearned. They are encoded at a level of automaticity that resists deliberate replacement, and they continue to emerge under conditions of stress, uncertainty, or cognitive load even after the context that originally prompted them has been entirely removed. Former members report, sometimes years after exit, that when they encounter a situation that would once have generated doubt about the group's doctrine, the thought-terminating phrase still arrives first, a reflexive interrupt that appears before the question can complete forming. Unlearning is not the same process as not learning. It is more complicated, slower, and less complete. The vocabulary was not just adopted, it was installed at a level below, where choosing happens. What leaving a cult requires at the neurological level is more extensive than simply deciding to go. Research on identity reconstruction and post-cult recovery has found that the exiting member faces a simultaneous and interdependent set of cognitive tasks, each of which would be demanding in isolation. Rebuilding a social network from outside the group, which requires trust in social contexts where the member has recently learned that trust is a mechanism of control. reconstructing a belief system and a framework for meaning from components that the group's total explanation had replaced, recovering access to an autobiographical self that predates the group's revision of who the person was, and rebuilding the critical thinking capacities, the habits of evaluating claims, tolerating ambiguity, and generating doubt that the group's environment had been systematically reducing. Each of these tasks depends on the others having been partly completed before it can progress. The recovery is not sequential. It is simultaneous and mutual, with each element waiting for the others to advance enough to support it. The rebuilding happens in all directions at once, with no stable ground to stand on while it proceeds. The grief of leaving a high control group is, according to clinical researchers including Alexandra Stein and Stephen Dubrow-Eichel, often the most surprising and disorienting part of the post-cult experience. Former members frequently expect to feel relief and liberation. They often also feel profound loss, not for the ideology, but for the community, the genuine human relationships built inside, the deep sense of purpose that sustained daily life, the feeling of mattering within a structure that had an answer for everything, and the particular quality of belonging that shared total commitment provides. Research on attachment and cult recovery has found that these losses are real, not simply evidence of continued entrapment. The community was real. The sense of purpose was genuinely felt. The belonging was an actual emotional experience, even if the conditions under which it was offered were exploitative. The mind cannot grieve only the parts that harmed it. It grieves the whole. A person does not leave a cult. They leave a life, and that life contained things that were worth having, which makes the leaving harder and the grief more legitimate than it is sometimes given permission to be. Research on complex PTSD and cult-related trauma has found that the psychological damage from long-term high-control group membership meets the clinical criteria for complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a diagnosis that reflects not a single traumatic event, but prolonged exposure to an environment of control, unpredictability, emotional coercion, and identity disruption. Studies published through the International Cultic Studies Association and in trauma research journals have found that former members show elevated rates of anxiety disorders, depression, dissociative symptoms, and difficulties with trust and interpersonal boundaries at levels consistent with other trauma populations. What distinguishes cult-related complex trauma from many other forms is that the harm was typically framed during the experience itself as help, as care, spiritual development, or preparation for a higher purpose. This framing makes the subsequent recognition of the harm not simply painful, but cognitively confusing in a specific way. The mind must simultaneously revise its understanding of the experience and its understanding of the self that participated in it. The hardest part of healing is not accepting that something bad happened. It is accepting that something bad happened while you believed it was good. Why some former members return to the group or leave one high control group and enter another is addressed in research on attachment patterns, and what Alexandra Stein's work on disorganized attachment in cult contexts has documented the pattern of disorganized attachment in which the attachment figure is simultaneously the source of comfort and the source of fear, producing an irresolvable internal conflict between approach and avoidance, mirrors the structure of the trauma bond formed inside the group. Stein's research found that this attachment pattern can persist after exit, driving former members back toward environments with familiar control structures because those environments, however harmful, produce a recognizable internal experience. The known architecture of a particular kind of belonging in a world that has otherwise become cognitively overwhelming. The return is not a failure of intelligence or willpower. It is the behavior of a nervous system trying to find a known pattern in a landscape that has become incomprehensible. The familiar harm is, to a nervous system calibrated around it, sometimes more navigable than the unfamiliar freedom. The conditioning installed during membership can remain dormant for years and reactivate under conditions of significant stress, fatigue, or identity disruption, a phenomenon that clinicians working with former cult members have observed consistently, and that research on stress-dependent memory retrieval provides a partial neurological explanation for. Under ordinary circumstances, the former member may function well, the critical thinking faculties recovered, the automatic obedience responses largely quieted. But when significant life stress reduces prefrontal regulatory capacity, when the resources the mind uses to suppress overlearned patterns are depleted by other demands, the conditioning installed in the group's environment can resurface with a freshness that surprises the person experiencing it, sometimes accompanied by the feeling of the group's presence, its vocabulary, its emotional logic. The mind does not fully exit every environment it has been built inside. Some of those environments become architectural features of who the person is, and they respond to the conditions under which they were first built. Stress returns the mind, briefly, to the shape that stress originally made. The children born and raised inside high control groups, what researchers call second-generation cult members, face a qualitatively different situation from adult recruits, one that research has only recently begun to address with sufficient depth. For second-generation members, there is no pre-cult self to recover. The group's total environment was the first environment the developing mind inhabited, the one that shaped not just their beliefs and behaviors, but the basic cognitive and emotional architecture through which all subsequent experience would be processed. Research on early childhood environment and neural development has found that the social and cognitive milieu of the first years of life has more structural influence on adult cognition than any subsequent environment, however intensive. The second-generation member leaving a high control group is not rebuilding something that previously existed. They are building for the first time something that was never allowed to form, an autonomous self in an outside world that was, for the entirety of their development, the enemy. They are not recovering a self. They are finding out whether they have one and what it is. Shunning The formal or informal, complete severing of contact with anyone who leaves or is expelled from a high control group is not simply a social policy. Research reviewed in Psychology Today has found that shunning activates the same neural pain pathways as physical assault, produces measurable increases in cortisol and cardiovascular stress responses, and can generate acute grief reactions comparable to bereavement in their neurological profile. The deliberate use of shunning as an exit deterrent, the advanced communication to members that anyone who leaves will be treated as though they no longer exist, turns the pain circuitry of the social brain into a preemptive instrument of control. The member does not need to experience shunning to be controlled by it. The knowledge that leaving will produce it, combined with the brain's structural registration of social exclusion as a survival-level threat, is sufficient to maintain compliance long after any intellectual commitment to the group's doctrine might otherwise have been withdrawn. The enforcement mechanism is not in what happens after you leave. It is in what the brain already knows about what that will cost. There is a specific and peculiar cognitive moment documented in survivor accounts and clinical literature that researchers have studied as the threshold of awareness. The experience from inside the group of beginning to see the structure. It does not typically arrive as a sudden revelation. It arrives more often as a growing inability to successfully terminate a particular thought, a question that the usual phrase no longer fully stops, a contradiction that the available framework no longer quite absorbs, a moment of looking at another member and having the thought, not yet acted on, barely formed, immediately suppressed, that something here is wrong. Research on belief revision in high control environments has found that this moment, when it comes, is extraordinarily fragile. It can be suppressed indefinitely by a sufficiently functioning thought-terminating system, or redirected by the prescriptions for responding to doubt, or simply overwhelmed by the cognitive and social weight of everything that has been built around not noticing it. But it is also, in the clinical literature, described consistently as the beginning of a process that, once started, proves difficult to fully reverse. Something has been seen, and what has been seen cannot be entirely unseen. The thought arrived before the person was ready for it. It waited, as such thoughts do, for the moment it could no longer be entirely closed. Something returns, not all at once, not in the order it was taken. But something comes back, and the fact of its return tells us something important, not only about what cults do, but about what the mind is and what it was built to need. What cult research ultimately reveals about human psychology is not primarily about groups, leaders, or ideological systems. Research by social psychologists, neurobiologists, and clinicians across several decades has established that the vulnerabilities cults exploit, the need for belonging, for coherent meaning, for a stable identity, for social approval, for the relief of certainty, are not the weaknesses of particular people. They are the structural features of a social brain shaped over hundreds of thousands of years to seek and maintain group membership as a condition of survival. The person who was recruited was not deficient. They were human. and they encountered a system specifically engineered to speak to the deepest grammar of human social need. The susceptibility is not evidence of something wrong. It is evidence of something real, of a mind built for connection, operating in conditions that turned connection into a mechanism of capture. The vulnerability was never the flaw. It was always the proof of how much the mind was built to need other people. The research psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun conducted from the mid-1990s on post-traumatic growth, the documented phenomenon in which people who survive severe psychological adversity sometimes emerge with a fundamentally altered and their own life, in certain dimensions strengthened relationship to their own life, has found consistent application in cult survivor populations. Former members assessed years after exit have shown meaningful indicators of post-traumatic growth, a deeper appreciation for ordinary experience, stronger and more honestly chosen relationships, an increased sense of personal resilience grounded in the specific knowledge of having survived something total, and a more conscious and deliberate relationship to questions of meaning than they had before. This is not a redemptive claim that the harm was worth it. The harm was real and the cost was real. But the research documents that something the group could not ultimately control, the mind's capacity to use even devastating experience as material for becoming more fully itself, survived the years of total environment and emerged on the other side. The group dismantled something. The mind, over time, built something else in the space where it had been, the recovery of the critical inner voice, the evaluative, questioning, doubt-generating internal narrator that the group's environment had spent months or years suppressing and replacing, is documented in clinical accounts as one of the most significant and most delayed aspects of post-cult cognitive recovery. Former members interviewed in research by Margaret Singer and Yanja Lalich have described the experience of the critical voice returning not as a sudden restoration, but as a gradual reawakening, the first noticing of a question forming before the habitual interrupt could close it, the first moment of sitting with an unresolved doubt without reaching for the prescribed remedy, the slow accumulation of instances in which the mind was allowed to examine something without the group's framework deciding the outcome in advance. The voice does not simply return, it is rebuilt increment by increment through the practice of using it in conditions where using it carries no consequence, which are conditions that, for a period after exit, feel unfamiliar and slightly dangerous in a way the person cannot always explain. The critical voice was not destroyed. It was waiting for a context in which being used was safe. Research on the timeline of cognitive recovery after cult involvement has found that different capacities return at different rates and through different mechanisms. Decision-making autonomy, the ability to make choices that feel genuinely one's own rather than performance of a role, tends to be among the first capacities to begin recovering, often within months of exit, as the behavioral control systems of the group lose their daily reinforcement. Critical thinking, the evaluation of claims against evidence, the tolerance of ambiguity, the generation of genuine doubt, takes considerably longer, often years, and its recovery is closely correlated with the quality of social support available during exit. Relationships that model genuinely open inquiry, that respond to doubt with curiosity rather than with correction, and that hold the former member in regard, regardless of what conclusions their thinking reaches. The internalized surveillance, the thought-terminating automaticity, is typically the last to fully quiet, and for some former members never quiets entirely, remaining a periodic visitor to the inner life that the recovered mind learns to recognize and decline to obey. Recovery is not a return to a prior state. It is the construction of a new one that has access to what was there before, but is no longer the same thing. The therapeutic function of narrative reconstruction, the process of building and repeatedly revising a coherent story about what happened from before the group through entry, immersion, and exit, has been documented in clinical literature on cult recovery as one of the most reliable vehicles for identity reintegration. Research on narrative identity, developed by psychologists including Dan McAdams, has established that the self is not a fixed object but an ongoing construction, continuously rebuilt through the stories the mind tells about what it has experienced and what those experiences mean. The former cult member's story is initially shaped by the group's version of what happened. They were lost, they were found, they were transformed, then they fell. Recovery requires replacing this story, not by denying the experience, but by authoring it from inside a self that is no longer defined by the group's vocabulary for what it means. The person who can tell their own story in their own language has begun to build the architecture for the self that inhabits that story. The self is the story. Changing who tells it changes what it is. The sleeping mind does something during recovery that it was prevented from doing fully during immersion. Research on REM sleep and emotional memory processing has found that the dreaming brain continues to integrate unresolved emotional material to return to experiences that waking cognition has not yet found a stable meaning for, and to represent them in ways that allow them to connect to the broader autobiographical self. Former members have described in clinical interviews a period during recovery in which their dreams shifted from reenacting the group's environment and the anxiety it produced towards something quieter and harder to name: the appearance of suppressed memories, the return of the pre-cult self in a form that felt both unfamiliar and deeply known, the experience of a continuity being restored beneath consciousness. Sleep, in this context, is not rest from the work of recovery. It is one of the primary places where that work proceeds, in a space the group never had full access to, where the original self was never entirely replaced. The sleeping mind kept something safe that the waking mind was not permitted to keep. Many former cult members, particularly those who have done sustained recovery work, develop a higher tolerance for ambiguity than they had before their involvement, a capacity to hold uncertainty without immediately resolving it, to sit with a question without demanding an answer that is measurably greater than their pre-cult baseline. Research on cognitive development through adversity has found that the experience of having lived inside total certainty and discovered its cost can produce, in people who process and integrate that experience, a specific and earned aversion to closed systems of thought. The mind that has felt the damage of having all its questions answered by an external authority tends to become suspicious of the comfort that comes from having all its questions answered at all. The skepticism is not cynical. It is the specific intelligence of someone who has learned from the inside what certainty costs. Surviving total certainty can make a person genuinely better at tolerating its absence. The paradox documented in clinical follow-up research with long-term cult survivors is that many of them, years after exit and sustained recovery, score higher on measures of critical thinking, epistemic humility, and tolerance of cognitive complexity than control populations who have never had their belief systems systematically challenged. Researchers studying cult recovery outcomes have offered a careful explanation for this. The experience of having internalized a closed belief system, discovered that it was closed, and then systematically dismantled it from the inside requires the exercise of exactly the cognitive capacities that critical thinking researchers consider most advanced. The ability to identify one's own motivated reasoning, to recognize the structure of belief as distinct from its content, and to maintain inquiry even when the conclusions of that inquiry are personally costly. The group taught these capacities by forcing eventually their most demanding application. The recovery required them, and in requiring them, built them. The most thorough school for critical thinking is the experience of having had it taken away. Identity, the sense of continuous selfhood that persists across time, context, and the accumulation of experience, is more resilient than the cult's total reshaping suggests, and more fluid than the person before entry believed. Research on identity continuity and disruption has found that even after profound and sustained environmental pressure toward identity replacement, core features of the self, the particular quality of what someone finds funny, what moves them, what they care about when no one is evaluating whether they should, tend to persist beneath the surface changes, inaccessible but not destroyed. Former members often describe the experience of encountering these features again after exit as recognition rather than discovery, not meeting something new, but finding something they had forgotten was missing. The identity was not replaced all the way down. Something remained that the group never reached, and the self that survived carries that persistent core as the seed of the rebuilt one. Something was always there. It was simply not permitted to speak. The metacognitive self, the capacity of consciousness to observe its own processes, recovers range slowly. It returns first in glimpses, a moment of watching the old thought-terminating phrase arrive and recognizing it for what it is. The ability to notice in real time that a conclusion was reached before the evidence had finished arriving. A small pause where before there had only been the automatic response. Research on metacognitive recovery in trauma populations has found that this widening of self-observation is one of the structural foundations on which other recovery capacities depend. The critical voice needs it. The tolerance for ambiguity needs it. The honest narrative reconstruction of what happened needs it. A mind that can watch itself thinking has regained access to one of the most specifically human capacities it possesses, the capacity to be present at its own operation and to make something of what it sees there. The watching self comes back, and what it finds, it can finally begin to examine. What cult psychology reveals about the social brain is not finally a story about manipulation. It is a story about need, the needs that cults exploit for belonging, for coherent meaning, for relief from the weight of individual decision-making, for the particular warmth of being chosen and known, are not manufactured by the group and injected into an otherwise self-sufficient mind. They are there first, before the group ever arrives. Research across evolutionary psychology, social neuroscience, and the psychology of meaning has established these needs as primary features of human cognition, as structurally prior to any particular belief, affiliation, or ideology. The group did not create something in the member. It found something already present and made an offer that spoke to it directly. Understanding what cults do requires, first, understanding what we all need. The cult is not a distant aberration. It is a mirror, deliberately angled. What the cult exploited was never pathology. It was the architecture of a social brain doing exactly what it was built to do. The continuum between ordinary social influence and cult influence is more continuous than the categorical difference between cult membership and ordinary life would suggest. Research on social influence and compliance by Cialdini, on attitude change and group dynamics by Festinger, and on totalistic environments by Lifton all converge on the same structural point. The mechanisms operating in cult recruitment and thought reform are not mechanisms invented by cults. They are the universal mechanisms of human social influence, operating at an extreme intensity with unusual comprehensiveness and unusual intent. Every social group uses some version of reciprocity, commitment escalation, social proof, and the reward of belonging. Every belief system uses some version of in-group identity and the reduction of uncertainty. The cult is not doing something categorically different from what all human social structures do. It is doing the same things further than they are ordinarily taken, with less restraint and with a leader who has decided that no limit applies. The distance between a cult and an ordinary group is a matter of degree. The mechanisms are shared. Healthy meaning-making, the kind that holds a life together without requiring a total environment to sustain it, differs from totalistic meaning-making in one structural feature that research on worldview and cognitive flexibility has found to be consistent and measurable. Healthy meaning systems hold their most fundamental commitments with enough openness to accommodate evidence, challenge, and the ongoing experience of being wrong about some things without losing their core. Totalistic systems achieve their comfort precisely by removing that openness. The meaning is total because it is closed, and it is comforting because it demands nothing from the self except compliance. The former cult member, rebuilding meaning from outside any total structure, must accept a meaning that cannot promise to answer everything. a meaning that remains open at its edges, where the unfamiliar and the unresolved live. This is harder. It offers less immediate relief, but it is meaning that belongs to the person who holds it, rather than to the system that issued it. Partial answers honestly held are worth more than complete answers that required giving yourself away to hold them. The small persistent self, the particular quality of attention, humor, care, and curiosity that survives even the most thorough identity replacement, is one of the most quietly significant findings in clinical post-cult research. Former members across different groups, different doctrines, different degrees of immersion, have described finding, sometimes years after exit, aspects of themselves that were present before the group and that the group never fully reached. An old interest returning, a way of noticing the world, a small preference, a quality of humor that felt, when it returned, both completely their own and somehow surprising, as though they had forgotten they were the kind of person who had it. These fragments are not trivial. They are the evidence that identity is more resistant than total environments believe it is. They are the clues the self left for itself in the dark that the self eventually found. The core does not disappear. It leaves traces that point back to itself. Recovery is not linear. Research on psychological healing after totalistic group involvement has found that the trajectory is nonlinear, frequently recursive, and shaped by conditions outside the individual's control. The quality of available support, the presence or absence of triggers, the particular demands the current life makes on the capacities still rebuilding. Former members describe good periods and difficult periods. The thought-terminating cliché that had been quiet for months arriving suddenly under stress, the grief returning for something already grieved. The critical voice, confident last week, going quiet in a context that resembles something the group used to own. Recovery does not move consistently forward because it is not traveling toward a fixed destination. It is assembling gradually, a self that has integrated what happened without being organized by it. That is a different process from healing a wound. It is more like learning to carry something. The goal is not to be the person who was never inside. It is to be someone who was inside and came back and knows the difference, what the experience gives back, what it returns to the person who survives it and does the work of recovery, is a specific and hard-won knowledge about the architecture of the human mind. The former cult member knows from the inside that belief can be installed without consent. They know that the social brain's need for belonging can be leveraged against its own interests. They know that certainty can be manufactured, that the inner voice can be replaced, that identity is more fluid than it presents itself as being. They know these things not theoretically, but somatically, in the body, in the automatic responses that still arrive sometimes, in the experience of having watched themselves change and then having watched themselves come back. This knowledge is not comfortable, but it is among the most precise maps of the human interior that a person can hold. And the person who holds it has become, in a very specific way, harder to capture than they were before. What the mind lost, it knows now in ways that knowing without losing cannot reach. The former member who has done the work of recovery eventually arrives at something that clinical researchers studying post-cult integrations describe as a particular quality of presence, an ability to be in a group, to feel warmth and belonging and shared purpose without disappearing into it, to feel the pull of a coherent explanation without surrendering the self that might find it incomplete, to want connection and to pursue it without paying for it with everything that makes them the particular mind they are. This is not detachment or cynicism. It is the opposite. It is a specific kind of being in the world that only becomes available to someone who has learned at significant cost where they end and the group begins. The boundary was always there. The cult worked hard to erase it. Recovery is, among other things, the long process of drawing it back. The boundary between self and group was always real. Recovery is the slow work of finding it again, and somewhere in the ongoing process of that recovery, in the ordinary, unspectacular daily practice of choosing one's own thoughts, asking questions that have no prescribed answers, and inhabiting a life that belongs to no one else, something very small and very persistent continues. The mind keeps waking. It keeps noticing. It keeps turning things over in the dark before it sleeps, asking what they mean, finding partial answers, finding more questions, not because it has been reprogrammed with better content, but because that is what minds do when they are left free enough to do it. That quality, the restless, searching, never quite finished quality of a mind attending to its own experience, was present before the group arrived. It survived the years inside, and it is there now, still turning, still asking, still refusing the comfort of a final answer. The question is still alive. That is the most important thing about it. If this stayed with you tonight, please like and subscribe.